in Ukraine, on the Ukraine funding, we're coming near to the end of the rope.
I said what I have said many times. If the Ukrainian side wants a real negotiation process, then we need to do this not with some theatrical gestures, but the first thing we need to do is to cancel the decree of the president of Ukraine prohibiting negotiations.
Hello, my name's Edward Druce. I'm a former 10 Downing Street special advisor. The news that there have been more Ukrainian military deaths since February 2022 than there were US troop fatalities in the nearly 2-decade Vietnam War will focus minds on the next few months, even years, and whether there might be an alternative to letting the slaughter continue. It's typically said that a peaceful resolution between the two sides is impossible, and that neither is willing to negotiate. Surely the only two options are to fight for every corner of Ukraine's 1991 borders or to appease a dictator. But this often forgets that even in the wake of the discovery of the Bucha massacre, peace talks did take place. And according to those involved, they very nearly succeeded. On the 29th of March 2022, there was a meeting of Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Turkey under the supervision of President Erdogan. Naftali Bennett, then Prime Minister of Israel, also conducted a parallel track of mediation directly between Zelensky and Putin. The base proposal was for Russia to move back to lines of the 23rd of February 2022. That is, freezing their hold on Crimea and part of the Donbass region, but otherwise retreating to the peninsula. Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Zelensky, said that day in Istanbul.
The Russian side has received this agreement where the means of ending the war are clearly indicated, to study it and suggest their counter-proposals. Of course, the agreement on security guarantees can only be signed after the ceasefire and the withdrawal of all Russian troops to the positions compromised upon, those of February 23, 2022. As for Crimea and Sevastopol, we have agreed bilaterally with the Russian Federation to a 15-year pause and to conduct bilateral talks regarding the status of these territories. Today's documents on the agreement about security guarantees are sufficient for announcing and holding the meeting between presidents.
2 days later, the 31st of March 2022, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, met with Chinese counterparts and said on Chinese state television,
"We regard the results of the talks that took place in Istanbul yesterday as a positive step forward. This is not the final result yet, but the Ukrainian negotiators have reaffirmed that Ukraine remains a non-nuclear state, stays neutral, and stays out of NATO. I consider this significant progress."
And that there had been genuine desire for peace from both sides was confirmed by Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of Israel during this period, in an interview in February 2023.
I was under the impression that both sides very much wanted a ceasefire. Putin made two big concessions after the original demands. He renounced disarmament and denazification. And I say to myself, wow, this is a big shift. So he's not going to fight at all costs. He has goals to achieve. That was the impression I got. I left very optimistic because he renounced joining NATO, which was the reason for the invasion. Putin said, "Tell me you're not joining NATO. I won't invade." He renounced his demands.
And that Zelensky had at the time renounced joining NATO was captured on video the 15th of March 2022 in a call with leaders of a British-led joint expeditionary force.
It's clear Ukraine is not a member of NATO. We understand it. We have heard for years about open doors, but we already heard that we won't be able to join it. It's the truth, and it's necessary to admit it. I'm glad that our people have started understanding it.
This was a significant public concession from Zelensky, though concurrently a ban on foreign military bases in Ukraine was already precluded by Ukrainian law. So what happened to this deal? Midway through talks, the horror of the Bucha massacre became apparent. Over 400 Ukrainian civilians have been killed by the Russian 234th Regiment around Yablunska Street. Initially, this did not dissuade Zelensky from negotiations, as evidence of civilian killings came to light. On the 4th of April 2022, the BBC reported. Ukraine's President Zelensky has said peace talks will continue with Russia despite accusing Moscow of war crimes and genocide. Mr. Zelensky was speaking in Bucha, near the capital Kiev, where bodies of civilians were found strewn on the streets after Russian troops withdrew. Responding to a question from the BBC on whether it was still possible to talk peace with Russia, Mr. Zelensky said, yes, because Ukraine must have peace. We are in Europe in the 21st century. We will continue efforts diplomatically and militarily. Mevlut Cavusoglu, then Turkish foreign minister and the second longest serving foreign minister in Turkey's history, overseeing the peace talks in Istanbul, said,
unfortunately, the images we have seen from Bucha and from some other regions damage the relatively positive atmosphere. And we are still hopeful and cautiously optimistic. At the same time, we are realistic. There are difficult issues, but we have to continue our efforts.
Can we expect some more
meetings?
Yes,
we expect some more meetings, possibly between the two negotiating teams, and then maybe foreign ministers, meetings of foreign ministers to initial the possible agreement. And both sides agreed that two presidents also could come together.
Achieving a peaceful resolution was still Zelensky's aim 5 days later. On the morning of the 9th of April 2022, in an interview with the Associated Press, Zelensky said,
People will accept peace in any case. People want this war to be over on our terms of independence. But nevertheless, I'm sure there are people, every family lost something, children. And I'm not sure that they would be satisfied with any kind of peace under any condition, at any time. Because it's a huge wound and a huge tragedy to lose your loved ones. But if we speak without emotion, however hard it is, we have to understand that every war should end in peace, or it will end with millions of victims. And even then, if there are millions of victims, eventually peace will come, the war will end. So from this, we have to draw conclusions. Yes, we have to fight, but fight for life. We can't fight for dust when there is nothing and no people. That's why it's important to stop this war. It's difficult, emotionally difficult. It's hard from the point of view of wanting. No one wants to negotiate with a person or people who tortured this nation. It's all understandable. And as a man, as a father, I understand this very well. We should not lose. This is not a wish. We don't want to lose the opportunities, if we have them, for diplomatic solutions of this matter. We should not lose them. We cannot afford to decide for millions of people who want to stop the war. Decide for them and say, no, we are not ready to speak with murderers.
But public support for a compromise had evaporated in light of the images from Bucha, and Zelensky's position wasn't supported by his negotiating team. Mevlut, again Turkey's then foreign minister, recounted on the 23rd of August 2022. We were hopeful after the meeting in Istanbul. There was an approach in Istanbul, but everything has changed. Images came from Bucha and the atmosphere changed. They, meaning Ukraine, moved away from the table. I think that was the breaking point. Naftali Bennett, again Prime Minister of Israel at the time, recounted similarly in February.
The Bucha massacre. Once that happened, I said, it's over.
The West isn't exempt from responsibility in the diplomats' accounts, however. Naftali was able to get as far as draft number 18 of an agreement directly between Zelensky and Putin.
We got to draft 1718. Did you write the draft yourself? No. How did it not get leaked out? Because we didn't let it.
He has said,
I'll say this in a broad sense. I think it was a legitimate decision by the West to keep striking Putin and not strike Putin. Putin was striking Ukraine. Hold on, yes, but given, the more aggressive approach, I'll tell you something. I can't say if they were wrong. So they blocked it? Basically, yes. They blocked it. I thought they were wrong. I have one claim. I claim there was a good chance of reaching a ceasefire.
This quotation was mistranslated in the interview's English subtitles that I just played for you, such that they read, they, which is referring to the UK and the US, basically blocked it, it's referring to a negotiated deal. This gave a false impression of British and American active interference, rather than a general belief from the UK and US that a deal would not come together and hold. The correct translation, which I have verified with independent Hebrew translators, is they basically stopped, meaning, in reality, the British and Americans merely gave up on contributing to diplomatic efforts. Naftali, as well as having been Israel's 13th Prime Minister, is also a former Israeli Defense Minister. During his active duty in the Israeli Defense Forces, specifically the Special Forces Unit Maglan, he won awards for his proficiency in taking out members of Hezbollah. So clearly he has no issue with military force when he thinks it's the strategically optimal thing to do. Opposition forces in Lebanon and those now in Gaza on the receiving end of bombardment in an attempt to destroy Hamas wouldn't exactly describe Naftali as an appeaser. But between Zelensky and Putin, he thought the most sensible route was diplomacy and put odds of reaching a ceasefire at the time at 50%.
What odds did you give it? 50%. Was there 50%? I think so.
A general sentiment of the West lacking enthusiasm to deal make was backed up by Mevlut, saying in an interview on the 23rd of August 2022, "We have said in the past that there are countries that would like the war to continue. This is a fact. In the West, there are countries that would like the war to continue, some NATO member countries. This does not solely mean the US. I am saying that there are countries, not just a country." This perception was further supported by a pro-Zelensky outlet, Ukrainian Pravda, in May 2022, running an article that said, according to Ukrainian Pravda sources close to Zelensky, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, who appeared in the capital almost without warning, this the afternoon of the 9th of April 2022, brought two simple messages. The first is that Putin is a war criminal. He should be pressured, not negotiated with. And the second is that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, they, which is implying the UK and the US, are not. Johnson's position was that the collective West, which back in February had suggested Zelensky should surrender and flee, now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they had previously imagined, and that here was a chance to press him. 3 days after Johnson left for Britain, Putin went public and said talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. Boris is rightly seen as a hero throughout Ukraine for being the first world leader to step up supply of military aid at so crucial a moment. But if that passage is accurate, could delivery of arms have been stepped up without an ask to break off diplomatic talks? Indeed, rather to fortify Ukraine's leverage in diplomatic talks. It's difficult to tell in retrospect. It's possible Boris was too jingoistic, but it's also possible that Boris's instinct was actually ahead of Zelensky's in intuiting the feeling of the Ukrainian people. Boris undeniably having a remarkable ability to read the mood of a country. At present, there's an overriding narrative in the West that Putin is not willing to negotiate. This is what Secretary Antony Blinken tells us.
And as to negotiations, John, it takes two to tango. Sure. And thus far, we see no indication that Vladimir Putin has any interest in meaningful diplomacy. If he does, I think the Ukrainians will be the first to engage, and we'll be right behind them.
But for anyone who listens directly to Putin, and I consider we should listen directly to foreign leaders, even or perhaps especially ones at war with our allies. This is simply not what Putin is saying. On the 17th of June 2023, meeting with heads of African states, Putin said clearly that he is open to talks.
Mr. President Ramaphosa, dear friends, Russia has never rejected the idea of negotiations. Let me point something out. With the assistance of President Erdogan, as you probably know, an entire series of rounds of negotiations took place in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. Those negotiations were centered on elaborating confidence-building measures and even drafting a treaty. The treaty was not supposed to be confidential, but we have never made it public before. This draft treaty was approved, was initialed by the head of Ukrainian negotiators. Here is the document with his signature. The document is right here. It is called a Treaty on Permanent Neutrality and Security Guarantees for Ukraine, the very security guarantees that you are speaking of. 18 articles. Moreover, there are addenda. And annexes, they have to do with the armed forces and other things. Everything is spelled out, including the number of units of military equipment and the personnel of the armed forces. The document is right here, and it was initialed by the Kiev delegation. Their signatures are there, but when we withdrew our troops from Kiev, the Kiev authorities, following the example of their masters, simply threw this all away to the dustbin of history. We have never rejected the idea of negotiating with them.
Putin doesn't concede that it was the Russian-inflicted horrors of Bucha, not merely the backing of Western masters, that led to Ukraine's withdrawal from talks. But at the same time, he could not have stated more clearly that he is open to negotiations. Putin echoed this in Vladivostok, calling out Secretary Blinken's comments for misrepresenting his willingness to talk.
Question about Ukraine. Just recently, Antony Blinken, State Secretary, has visited Ukraine. He gave an interview to ABC, and in that interview he said that Ukraine is willing to engage in talks with Russia, and he added that the terms and the future border is going to depend on the opinion of Ukraine. He also said that peace talks are currently unattainable because it takes two to tango, and currently Russia does not want to talk. Can you comment on that? Why is the State Secretary making such announcements on behalf of Ukraine? As far as the negotiating process is concerned, if the U.S. believes that Ukraine is ready to engage in talks, then Ukraine needs to lift the presidential decree that prevents Ukraine from engaging in talks. There is a presidential decree, and by that decree he banned himself and all the rest from entering into talks. Blinken says that Ukraine is ready. Well, then this decree, to start with, needs to be lifted.
Putin's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, 2 weeks ago also welcomed negotiations. We should be aware that, in contrast to this, Zelensky signed a decree on the 4th of October 2022 saying, "We are ready for a dialogue with Russia, but with another president of Russia." This was an entirely understandable reaction to Russia's annexation of several other territories: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Putin is mafia. I am not trying to dispute this point. But we should also acknowledge, despite what we hear in the mainstream and from Secretary Blinken, it is Ukraine, not Russia, that has presently put a block on dialogue. The support that Ukraine's bravery has solicited globally has been striking. But the news that war has so far killed or injured nearly 500,000 people, ought to make us take stock and ask, is stoking this conflict by encouraging yet more fighting really the best policy? In March 2022, the world watched as Ukraine launched a spectacular fight back. This was before its military retook Snake Island and other territory. It looked then as if Ukraine may even repel the invader. But with the counteroffensive having been so lethal and for such minute territorial gain, the most likely scenario now being one in which war continues in a blood-stained stalemate, are tens of thousands more lives not going to be needlessly lost continuing as we are. Ukrainian authorities are struggling to administer medical necessities, and White House spokesperson John Kirby said the following just last week on American support.
You don't want to be trying to bake in long-term support when you're at the end of the rope. And in Ukraine, on the Ukraine funding, we're coming near to the end of the rope. I mean, today we announced $200 million, and we'll keep that aid going as long as we can, but it's not going to be indefinite.
I'm attuned to Mikhailo Podolyak, again senior advisor to Zelensky's comments immediately after revelations at Bucha, this on the 8th of April 2022. Some people, in particular Western businessmen, believe that somehow everything can be rolled back, but it will not happen. Many are worried that the Russian invasion may end with the signing of the conditional Minsk III, Budapest II, or Istanbul I. I answer very simply. President Zelensky is much deeper into the material than anyone else today. He understands all the risks of any unfinished business and sees the perspective for decades ahead. Therefore, we will not go to Minsk III or Budapest II. It all makes no sense. In the historical perspective, even in the short term, all these Minsks lead to grandiose tragedies. All these agreements will not work without real mechanisms of war prevention. We will not go for it. It is a matter of principle. But looking back at the record, the morning after these comments, as I've shown in extensive quotation, Zelensky himself was willing to negotiate. The history of these diplomatic talks need to be better known, and the British and American governments and many more Western media outlets ought to be speaking with Turkish diplomats to get a second opinion on what would be a sensible next step from where we are today. Mevlut put forward an updated view on the 29th of April 2022 at the Bled Strategic Forum.
It was much easier in the initial weeks. Now it is not that easy to reach a negotiated solution, unfortunately, because things have changed. After the images, disturbing images we saw from Irpin and Bucha, things have changed. But now there are new realities on the ground. Unfortunately, some cities other than Donbas region of Ukraine have fallen. And we are talking about peace, but it has to be a mutually accepted one. But it has to be at the same time a fair peace for Ukraine. What do we mean? Territorial integrity of Ukraine has to be ensured. And now, can they go back to the negotiation table? Is it that easy? And these new realities definitely will be reflected in the further negotiations. And even the status, their positions on the status of Crimea and Donbas have been changed. So it is not that easy. Plus,
but there are no conditions of any kind to even begin a dialogue. Is that what your
There is a dialogue. There is a dialogue.
And
there is a dialogue, and we are doing our best. We are outreaching both sides, and we have good relations, of course, with both Russia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, of course, we have principled stance, and we are supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. We are providing support, maybe more than many other NATO allies to Ukraine.
What does Mevlut, as of June 2023, no longer in ministerial office, think now in October 2023, given the current state of the counteroffensive? Does he have suggestions of how a further round of peace talks between Zelensky and Putin could have the potential to succeed? And to risk one more unpopular question, could China play a role here? While this might seem fanciful, this is something that Secretary Blinken said in May he would welcome.
What do you think, in principle, Mr. Secretary, about the idea of the United States working in parallel some point down the road with China to seek a stable outcome here?
In principle, there's nothing wrong with that. If we have a country, whether it's China or other countries that have significant influence, that are prepared to pursue a just and durable peace, and I'll come back to what that means in a minute, we would welcome that. And it's certainly possible that China would have a role to play in that effort. And that could be very beneficial. There were elements in the plan that China put out, things that actually it had said, and many others had said for some time, that were positive.
Putin has, just this past week, welcomed the same.
Well, we naturally know the proposal of our Chinese friends. We highly value these proposals. I believe that they are quite realistic. In any case, they could be used as the basis for peace agreements.
And here's Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world that's US-based, who has written extensively on emerging great power conflict and is someone who for decades has personally known members of both US and Chinese leadership. My more attainable stretch goal would be for the US and China to jointly broker peace in Ukraine. While that is a stretch goal, it might be attainable as conditions are ripening for this to happen. Imagine if the two leading and opposing world powers that are currently lining the sides up for a hot war join forces to deliver peace. That would be terrific because besides delivering peace, it would reduce the risks of the Russia-Ukraine war leading to worse wars and would also show that they could work together for peace. If they did that, maybe they, the US and China, could develop a dynamic that would bring about peace rather than conflict in other areas. Diplomacy, of course, needs to be conducted in a strong way. The late George Shultz. Negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. Before tens of thousands more get killed, shouldn't the British Prime Minister at least speak with the figures today who've been closest to bringing about peace, see what can be learned, and see if there might be another way?